how's it going? Today we're going to talk about a whole bunch of new annuals that are coming out this year, 2022. I've had a chance to try out several of these. In fact, you might recognize some of them from some of our arrangements this past year, so I'll be able to share a few of my thoughts and experiences with some of these, at least 1 year's worth of experience. Some of them I haven't had a chance to try yet, so we'll run through those pretty quickly. It's just fun to learn about new plants. They might be improvements on old varieties that you might already know about, but they may have a better growth habit now or higher resistance to heat, humidity, disease, things like that, or they may be brand new varieties altogether. We usually do a new perennial and new shrub video as well, so that's something to watch out for. But because there are so many, there are over 30 brand new annuals coming out this year, I'm just going to jump right in, starting with two brand new SUPERTUNIAs for this year. First of all, SUPERTUNIAs as a whole are an amazing group of annuals. Trailing petunias that don't require deadheading. You don't need very many of them to create a huge amount of impact, especially if you get a SUPERTUNIA within the VISTA line. One of the new ones is a brand new VISTA, which is exciting, and those are extremely vigorous, but they're just something I lean heavily on in our own garden and in other projects around this area. They just do really well for us. So the new SUPERTUNIA VISTA is called JAZZBERRY. It's a beautiful new pink VISTA. So you might be familiar with VISTA Bubblegum, VISTA Fuchsia, VISTA Silverberry, VISTA Snowdrift, which is a fairly new one that's all white. The fun part about the JAZZBERRY is that it's very much so more of a cool pink. If you put it right next to a VISTA Fuchsia, you'll see how much more orange is in that fuchsia and how it lends itself more to a warm color palette as opposed to the JAZZBERRY. And I tried it in our chicken coop containers last year in our raised beds behind the greenhouse and just experienced really good growth out of it, and I really enjoyed the color. The other one is SUPERTUNIA PRISCILLA, which you might be familiar with already. That variety has been around for a while, but they have improved it. So it's SUPERTUNIA PRISCILLA improved, and it has a better growth habit, more flowers, and I grew it last year in our containers in front of the barn, and I really did notice a huge difference. In fact, I skipped a few years planting it because the older version just didn't hold up to the vigor of the other plants I put it with. And I noticed how much more robust it was this last year. I paired it with another new plant called Cake Pop's Purple Verbena, which we'll talk about in a minute. So I paired it with that along with Scaevola Whirlwind Pink, and it was a beautiful, soft, lavender, beautiful display, and they all cohabitated beautifully together. And Cake Pops is next on my list. So Cake Pop's Purple Verbena, Cake Pop's Pink Verbena, both very similar, just different in color. They're just a new type of verbena that grow anywhere from 10 to 18 inches tall and wide, but excellent for really hot, sun-loving, maybe drought-tolerant sort of arrangements. They don't cycle out in the heat. They keep on blooming even through the high heat, and I did notice that with the Cake Pops that I planted. I was really happy with them, and they tend to have a little bit of a different growth habit than the verbena or superbenas that I'm used to planting. Usually they'll come out and trail. They're not a strict trailer. They'll come out and be a little bit bushy and then start trailing. The Cake Pops come out a little bit higher, so they start to incorporate with your other plants, and then you'll see, you know, SUPERTUNIAs here with Cake Pops blooms coming out through the SUPERTUNIA canopy, so they incorporate beautifully. I really enjoyed them. And while we're on the verbena subject, there is a new SUPERBENA called IMPERIAL Blue. I have a bunch of these ordered for next year. I'm so excited to try them out. They grow up to like 30 inches. That's huge for an annual. I mean, almost 3 feet. They are an improvement to the SUPERBENA Dark Blue. So they have really high mildew resistance. They bloom earlier than the other varieties do. They have big flowers that don't fade. And I'm partial to that color. So I'm very excited to see how these do in my garden. Next is a new flowering vine called Coconut Appeal THUNBERGIA. It's a type of black-eyed Susan vine. You might be familiar with orange appeal, lemon appeal, tangerine slice appeal. I've grown all 3 of those in the past. Coconut Appeal has a bright kind of creamy white bloom with a black throat. Beautiful contrast. I planted them in 2 areas last year. I planted them earlier on in the summer in our 2 square containers that flank the opening to our cut flower garden. They're quite large, and then they had a huge obelisk in the center, and they climbed all the way to the top, and then they started to kind of like grow back down because they were so vigorous. Blooms all over them. Really enjoyed them. I had a mix of yellows and whites in that container that did really well. One container got plugged up halfway through the season, which a few of the other brand new annuals I tried in those containers, and they got a little flooded, but I think that's good to maybe put these plants through the paces a little bit and see how they come through it, and this one did great. Next are a couple of new Coleus in the COLORBLAZE series, which COLORBLAZE Coleus can handle both sun and shade. I've thoroughly tested that out because I didn't believe it at first, but they truly can take quite a bit of sun. They may need a little bit more water in that case, but I've had excellent luck with all of the Coleus in that line. The first one is called BRIGHTO. Now, I did grow this last year, and it was probably in my top 3 favorites of anything I grew last year. They did so phenomenally well, and I tried them both in the ground and in containers. I had them in the ground near our back shade porch. I got a little bit more dappled light. And then I had them in a couple of containers with some skyrocket pennisetum and can't remember everything else. I think I put some calla lilies in there near our chicken coop. The BRIGHTO ended up being the star of the show, really wherever I put it. Definitely in those containers, it became the star of the show. And then I planted them in a rectangular shaped kind of silver trough with Pegasus begonias and Prince Tut grass. That one turned out beautiful. I also had Creeping Jenny because you could see layers throughout the season. You could see the Strictly Weeping Creeping Jenny out the front, and then you could see Pegasus begonia leaves kind of in front of this big bank of BRIGHTO Coleus, and then you could see a little bit of that Prince Tut over the top. It was a really pretty combination. And the color on this one, there's a lot of salmon pink in there, and I just loved it. So pretty. The other one is called Newly Noir, which is a super dark burgundy. I will be planting more of that one as well this next year, but I did plant it in the ground under a lilac tree where it got a lot more shade. And then I planted it on the north side of our chicken coop along with some impatiens and I think some Limetime Coleus in there too, and Prince Tut. And that little area is kind of weird. It's in shade all day until the last couple of hours of sun. So that really intense time of day where it's really hot, that's when that area got sun. But the COLORBLAZE Coleus can handle it. Next is a salvia called Unplugged Pink, and this was a learning curve for me. I did plant these in 2 different locations last year. I put them in our 14 large containers lining our east fence line as a centerpiece plant because they will grow 14 to 30 inches tall. But I did notice that they wanted to stay more compact. They didn't have the same vigor as like your plain the blue salvia that could definitely match the vigor of like a SUPERTUNIA VISTA bubblegum. So I messed up there because the SUPERTUNIAs just overtook the vigor of this plant. You could see in a few containers like some blooms trying to get through. So I learned a lot from that. I also planted them in between our boxwood hedge around an urn in one of our gardens, in between the boxwoods and the denim and lace Russian sage. And I think that all those plants have gotten too big for me to plant annuals in there. So last year we decided this is the last year I think we're gonna put annuals in this spot. We're just gonna let the perennials and shrubs be the show here. So I just didn't give it a spot with enough room or enough light to compete with everything else in there. So it was definitely a learning year, but beautiful color. The thing I love about this type of salvia is that you have the bright pink bloom, but then the calyx that holds the bloom on is kind of a deep burgundy pink itself. So even when the bloom kind of fades and falls off, it still looks like the plant has an interesting bloom on it. You don't feel the need to deadhead this type of plant all the time, which I really appreciate. Then there are 3 new types of pelargoniums coming out, also called geraniums. They are a hybrid between a zonal geranium and an ivy geranium. There's one called Boldly Coral, which I'm really excited about. I love that color, so I do have some of those ordered. I haven't tried that specific variety yet. There's also Boldly Hot Pink and Boldly White. So these get the large clusters of flowers. They grow about a foot tall, up to almost 2 feet wide, and they've got really good heat tolerance, so they continue to bloom even through the hottest part of the summer. Next is a new Lobularia or sweet alyssum called Violet Night. I did grow these last year. I put them in the ground around our maple trees a little bit late in the season, but all of the Lobularias grow so wonderfully well. The vigor of these plants, so there's Snow Princess, White Knight, Blushing Princess. The Violet Night here has deep purple and kind of lavender blooms. They have that sweet alyssum smell, and just the vigor of these plants. I think that the tags usually say they grow up to a couple of feet, but I've had these plants get absolutely enormous. So I pull one annual and there's its root ball right here, and then the canopy of this plant just goes out a couple feet on either side. They are just amazing. Like, I would almost say they'd be okay to pair up with a SUPERTUNIA VISTA. Maybe I'll try that this year just to see what kind of growth rate. I mean, because by the end of the season, they could be close to the same size. I've just been really, really enamored with the growth of these because it's nothing like the little packs of ALYSSUM that you can pick up. These just, you don't need very many of them. They just take over and do great. Like take over in the best way. There's a couple of new lobelia. There's Laguna Sky Blue Improved, so an improvement on an older variety. They're always trying to improve lobelias to have larger flowers, showier flowers, and better heat tolerance so that they'll continue going on through the season. We've had problems with old varieties of lobelia just kind of fizzling out and really just not holding up to the heat and dry climate that we have here. I planted the Laguna Cloud White as the other new one. Bright white blooms. I planted those in with the Pegasus begonias and El Brighto Coleus. That's also a learning curve. Typically, my learning curve includes planting things too close together and realizing that something can't match the vigor of the other thing, and that's what happened with the lobelia. However, even when it was later in the season and the other plants were huge, I could kind of like pick through and I could still see flowers, which was amazing given the fact that they were being smothered by other things and it had been so hot. We had weeks over 100 degrees this last year and a ton of wind, the windiest year that I can remember this past year, and they held up through that. So again, kind of like with the unplugged pink salvia, I need to try these again, but give them the space that they need and put them with other things that don't get as huge as COLORBLAZE Coleus does. Next is a new lantana called Luscious Citron. I planted these in a couple of different spots last year. One spot was in the pots flanking our cut flower garden along with the coconut appeal THUNBERGIA, and they did really well out there because it's full sun. These like lots of sun, lots of heat. This variety has bigger, kind of more rich yellow flowers than a lot of the older varieties of yellow lantana, and they've got a much more full growth habit. So they can get upwards of 30 inches tall and wide. Mine didn't get quite that large because I had them planted with a lot of other things, but on their own, given the space, they can get quite large in one season, and they provide color through the whole season. They love heat, they don't need a ton of water. They also have little to no seed set. So if you're in an area where lantana are or can be invasive, this would be a really good variety because you won't have that issue with this one. We don't have that issue here, but it might be something that you have to think about. Almost forgot, the other spot I planted it is in the chicken coop pots. I had them with the VISTA JAZZBERRY. I had Helichrysum icicles, so like bright blue leaf structure, and then the bright yellow blooms, and then the pink jazzberry, and then I had SUPERBENA sparkling amethyst. It was such a pretty, bright, happy blend of flowers. I loved it. The next two are Safari Dawn and Safari Sky JAZZBERRY, which I just learned about JAZZBERRY maybe 2 years ago. I'd actually never even heard of that plant before. I'd never seen one. So I was very excited to grow the Safari Dawn variety this last year, and the colors would remind you of a sunset. They're kind of a rosy pink lavender, kind of dusty pink with a yellow apricot eye. And they kind of shift through the season. Like the colors kind of look a little different. They're just absolutely beautiful. The shape of the blooms and the growth habit, like the size and shape of the plant, would remind you a bit of a bacopa, if you're familiar with those. But bacopa tend to be a little bit more finicky in terms of water. If you let them accidentally dry down, it's hard to rebound them, especially once you get into the really hot part of the summer. So I've kind of shied away from planting a lot of bacopa through the years, unless it's like a really perfect location that's filtered light and a drip irrigation system set up and things like that. But the JAZZBERRY I had in a low concrete planter near Benjamin's butterfly garden, and that thing was just mounded with color the whole season. They can take a little bit of drought, they like the heat, and they've got really good resistance to powdery and downy mildew, which I guess in years past on older varieties that has been a problem, but these are highly resistant. The Safari Sky has a lavender kind of color with a white halo and a yellow eye. They're both just really striking, and they kind of have a glow quality to them. Next is a new sunflower called SUNCREDIBLE Saturn. So you might be familiar with SUNCREDIBLE Yellow. We've been growing that for a few years now, have had amazing luck. In fact, we use SUNCREDIBLE Yellow down at the college and those flower beds, and oh my word, was that a good choice down there. If you have a full sun location where you can't put something that gets enormous, for an annual it gets big, but it's not like your other sunflowers. In fact, the other really cool part about this is that they're in color from the moment they start flowering early in the season. They are in color from the moment you plant them until the moment a hard frost takes them. As opposed to when you plant, your sunflower seeds, you have to tend them and wait until they grow up, and a lot of times you know, the growth habit just isn't as nice. These will get 2 to 3 feet tall, upwards of 3 feet wide, and they're in this just huge mound of color. It's not like one plant and then just flowers up here. It's just like a huge ball of color. So we planted the SATURN variety in the one plant per pot project that we conducted this past year in front of the greenhouse, and they did beautifully. It was just a concrete pot with one plant in the middle, and it filled that up wonderfully. And then the other place I planted them was in a row out in our cut flower garden because I just wanted to see how they would respond out there. And they were one of the most colorful spots out there. They hold up really well in cut flower arrangements. And the difference, which I should have talked about this first, SUNCREDIBLE yellow is a clear yellow sunflower, and the flowers aren't massive. They're pretty good size, 4 inches maybe. The SATURN has yellow with a red, like russet kind of halo around the center. So just a little bit of a different variation. The next one is a heliotrope called Augusta Lavender. I haven't had a chance to grow this one, but the blooms on it are beautiful. And supposedly it has incredibly high tolerance to heat and humidity. So it blooms a lot longer through the season. It can get upwards of 2 feet tall by 3 feet wide. That's a huge heliotrope. And it has that classic scent, but with the lavender flowers, white halo and yellow eye. So these flowers also have kind of that glowing quality. I'm hoping I get some of these this year because boy, I love heliotrope. But typically, you know, old varieties, they bloom in the spring and the cooler months, and then they fizzle out and they're pretty much nothing by the time heat sets in. So it's nice to have maybe a variety that will last through the season. Excited about that one. Next is Blue My Mind XL Evolvulus, which grows 30 to 50% larger, I guess, than the older variety of Blue My Mind Evolvulus. This type of annual prefers a hot, humid climate. So great for those of you in the south, where it's hot and humid all the way through the day, and then it maintains that pretty much through the night as well. For us here in high desert, this plant just doesn't perform like I think it could, because we can be 105 during the day, but then we'll go down to 70 at night, sometimes even a little bit lower. So our temperature fluctuations and the dry air, I just don't think are conducive to like excellent performance from this variety. So for those of you in the south, really great one for you. Then there's a couple of varieties of Callilophus. I doubt I'm saying that right. Common names Texas Primrose. There's Ladybird Lemonade, which is a beautiful, just soft yellow color, very fine foliage. And then there's Ladybird Sunglow, which I did plant in raised beds, and I'm not sure that I actually got pictures of it. I'll look. But I planted it in with SUPERTUNIA Vista Fuchsia, some Berry Treasure strawberries, also with some Nepeta. I had cat's pajamas back there and some hops in the same raised bed. I just kind of threw everything in there, and it was a beautiful bright spot. So it doesn't get very tall, 4 to 8 inches tall, upwards of 20-inch drape spread on it. So it's a really good one to put in the landscape, let it kind of spread around on the ground as like your front of your border, or as a spiller rather in a container. But they do like areas where long, hot, dry days and cooler nights. So performed really well for me. Next is a Superbells called Double Twilight. Beautiful silver lavender petals, double with like a deeper purple throat. It would remind you of a SUPERTUNIA Priscilla or a Bordeaux. I did plant this variety last year. Did not have good luck because our watering. So first of all, I put them in some urns with evergreens, and every time I put things with evergreens, something usually suffers a little bit. I'm not sure why, but the zone that the drip was on with those urns was stuck on somehow. We didn't even realize it because all the water was draining out the back. And one day I was kind of looking at the pots and kind of saw a sheen, like a shimmer, and went over there, and it was just water, like completely full of water on top of the soil surface. And those plants were just drowning, and Superbells like to dry out. So they like water too. In fact, whenever I see Superbells really thriving, and maybe I need to do this, they are in hanging baskets because they like water to kind of quickly saturate their roots and then dry out, and then saturate their roots and then dry out. They don't want like this consistent moist kind of soil sitting around their roots all the time. And I traditionally don't plant a lot of hanging baskets because it's just not my thing. I mean, I usually plant a few, and I'll probably continue to do that in the future, but I think I need to focus Superbells on like in hanging baskets, make that a thing. Anyway, I'm excited to try these out again because I think they're absolutely beautiful. Next is an ageratum. I'm not sure I pronounced that right. Also known as floss flower, called Artist Pearl. So it's a white version. You might be familiar with a blue version. There's one called Artist Blue I have planted in the past. So the Artist Pearl is bright white. They have like little button blooms that are like fuzzy. They're really interesting to look at. These do what's called burying their dead, in that they flush out blooms, and then when these are kind of fizzling out, the plant kind of flushes out again and blooms over the top of the spent blooms underneath. I still found myself, so I mean, essentially you don't have to deadhead this plant because, you know, the new blooms kind of overtake the old ones. I did find myself wanting to pop old blooms off though, where I could still see them, because white blooms tend to dry out looking a little bit more brown. It wasn't a huge maintenance issue, but it's just something I noticed. They don't get super big, so I think it's like 10 inches tall or 12 inches tall and about that wide. I planted mine in with the other things in the big black square containers by our cut flower garden. So the coconut appeal, THUNBERGIA, I had osteospermums, bright light yellow, luscious citron, lantana, white knight lobularia, and SUPERTUNIA limoncello. I had a lot of stuff in those containers, and I could still see these at the end of the season. So I was impressed with their ability to keep up, even though the mature size of this plant isn't huge. Another flower I had in those same containers out there, the black square ones, was an angelonia called Angel Face Cascade Snow. And I was really impressed by the growth habit of this one and how long it bloomed. I mean, it bloomed from the second I planted it. In fact, this type of angelonia blooms a couple weeks earlier than older varieties, and it bloomed all the way through a hard frost. They can get upwards of 30 inches long. I'm not sure mine got that big because I had it in with so many other things. In fact, I was worried for a lot of my plants in there because I had put lobularia, a white knight, which, you know, we talked about the lobularia earlier, and they can get so big. I thought, oh, I don't know, this might be a mistake. But the angelonia, you could still see it just come in, like it intermixed beautifully, and you could see, you know, pieces of it coming up through other annuals and like cascading down. It was beautiful, and I like how elegantly it intermixes. Instead of being a strict weeper or a strict mounder, it just kind of had this graceful habit about it. The last 7 annuals are caladiums, all of which I have not tried growing yet. In fact, caladiums are fairly new for us growing here in the high desert because traditionally a lot of the older varieties of caladiums just didn't do well here. It took them forever to get going. You had to have a really nice shady protected area for them, and then, you know, you'd have to either dig the bulbs or corms. I think they call them corms. Anyway, in the fall, and either hold them over or just treat them as annuals. And now some of these newer varieties that are coming out can withstand a lot more adversity. They can stand a lot more sun, and we have put them through the test. We've tried some of my favorites. Chinook is one of my favorites. It has a lot of salmon pink in it. We planted that in a really sunny spot couple of years ago, and they did beautifully. White Wonder is also really pretty. Snowdrift is a beautiful one. I think the White Wonder can take more sun than Snowdrift, but anyway, yeah, a lot of improvements in the caladium area, and they do get going fairly quick for us, which is nice. So I'm just going to kind of run through these fairly quickly. There's the first one is called Bold and Beautiful. Huge leaves, again, green on the outer portion, white face with pink veining. It's kind of an intermediate size, so 15 inches tall and about 14 inches wide is what it tops out at. This one is called Burning Heart. It's kind of a brick red. I guess it's a fairly new color within kind of the caladium realm, and it is striking. So you've got the bronze brick red leaves with the white spots on them. They can get upwards of 20 inches tall and 14 inches wide. The next one is called Clowning Around. This is probably my favorite of all 7 because, again, you've got the coral pink. You've also got some really interesting kind of crinkly looking leaves. You've got green on the outside, kind of a white face with the coral pink veining, and then some speckling in there too, and a lot of cream. It grows 20 inches tall by 14 inches wide. And then there's Hot to Trot, which is a bright red with a green leaf margin. It grows 15 inches by 14 inches. The next one is called Hot Flash, and it looks similar to Hot to Trot except for a little bit more on the pink side of red with the green margin. And then there's White Star. This one can take more sun. It gives you that bold white foliage texture with the green margin, and it grows 15 inches by 14 inches. And the last one is called Explosion, which has a really interesting mix of green, kind of a sagey green there, and red and pink and white. Really beautiful, and it has a really strong mounded full habit. So those are the new varieties of annuals for 2022. What did I say, like 33 varieties? That's a lot. There's a lot of new plants to look forward to. You'll probably start to see them show up at your garden centers this year. If there's something you like specifically, make sure you're talking to somebody at your local garden center. That way they can be watching for things when they're ordering, or even talking to the growers. Sometimes it can take growers a little while to get on board with new varieties, so just make sure you're talking about it. Anyway, I hope you guys enjoyed this video. I always love talking about new plants, and I'm excited to try a lot of these that I haven't tried. I'm hoping to get them this next year and get them in the ground, see how they do, and retry on some of them like the Super Bells, because it's such a beautiful plant. But anyway, thank you guys so much for watching, and we will see you in the next one. Bye.